Hello, and welcome back. I'm glad you're here tonight. Tonight, we're going somewhere small and quiet. Behind the baseboard of an old townhouse in the village of Fernhollow, where 5 tiny creatures called the Tidwells are about to begin their night. The shop below is closed. The herbs are resting in their jars. And upstairs, Ada has finally put down her pen and gone to bed. Whatever today was, leave it where it is. We're not going back to it tonight. Notice where you are right now. Your head on the pillow, your body supported. Comfortable enough is exactly where we start. Let your eyes close if they haven't already. Not forced, just resting. Let your face ease, your forehead, your jaw, the space behind your eyes. Think of a small, warm room, walls of old wood, a single candle burning on a shelf, the smell of chamomile and something faintly earthy, like the inside of a drawer that has held good things for a very long time. Let your shoulders drop. Feel the width of your back against the mattress. Let your arms lie where they are. Your hands can stop holding on to anything now. Behind the baseboard, the Tidwells are gathering. Moss is on his stool. Willa has set her sewing aside. Wren is standing near the gap, listening to the house. Lark is thinking about something. Lark is always thinking about something. And Tuck is sitting cross-legged on the floor, waiting, with the particular patience of someone who knows that something good is about to happen. Your legs are heavy now. Your feet can be still. Outside, Fernhollow is settling into the dark. The lane is quiet. The shop windows are black. The old oak on the village green stands in the moonlight, and somewhere a clock is about to strike 12. The Tidwells are ready, very gently now. Let's go and see how the night begins. The ink bottle had been on its side since Tuesday. Lark had noticed it at dusk, pressed against the gap in the baseboard, watching the last of the amber light move slowly across Ada's kitchen floor. The bottle had rolled from the edge of the worktop sometime during the afternoon. Lark had not seen it happen, only the result. A thin trail of dark blue ink, no longer than a finger, had dried on the wooden floor beside it. The bottle itself had come to rest against the leg of the kitchen table, stopper still in, most of the ink still inside. It was a small thing, the kind of thing Ada might not notice for days, the kind of thing that, left alone, had a way of becoming a larger thing. A knocked bottle, a spilled mess, a ruined sketch. A morning made harder than it needed to be. Lark had watched it for a long time before going back through the gap to tell the others. Behind the baseboard of Ada's kitchen, the Tidwell home was warm and low-ceilinged and smelled of dried chamomile and old wood. The walls were lined with shelves no taller than a thumbnail, each one holding the careful accumulation of years. A row of acorn caps used as bowls, a length of red thread coiled around a button, 3 small squares of folded fabric in different colors, a cork stopper that Moss had been meaning to do something with for as long as anyone could remember. A single stub of candle burned on the central shelf, its flame barely moving in the still air, throwing a small circle of amber light across the floor and leaving the corners in a soft, comfortable dark. They were all there. Moss sat on a low stool near the back wall, a small tool resting across his knee, his hands quiet for the moment. He had been working earlier. There was a faint smell of metal and something resinous near where he sat, and a tiny curl of wood shaving on the floor beside his foot that he had not yet swept away. Willa was beside him, a red scarf looped twice around her shoulders, her fingers working a length of thread through a piece of cloth with the slow, unharried rhythm of someone who had done this 10,000 times and expected to do it 10,000 more. The cloth was a deep green, the color of moss on a north-facing wall, and she was hemming it along one edge with stitches so small they were nearly invisible. Wren stood near the entrance gap, arms folded, listening to Lark's report with the particular stillness she reserved for information she was already processing. And Tuck sat cross-legged on the floor between Moss and Willa, chin in both hands, eyes moving from face to face with the focused attention of someone determined not to miss anything. "The stopper is still in," Lark said. "Most of it is still inside the bottle." "Most," said Wren. "There is a small trail on the floor, dried already. That part we cannot do much about." Wren looked at Moss. Moss looked at the tool on his knee. "The bottle needs to come upright," Moss said, "before she knocks it again in the morning and loses the rest." "It is against the table leg," Lark said, "wedged slightly." "How slightly?" Lark held up 2 fingers close together. Moss nodded slowly. He picked up the tool from his knee and turned it once in his hand, the way he always did before deciding anything. It was a small thing, his tool, a length of wire bent at one end, wrapped in a strip of leather where he held it. He had made it himself years ago, from things Ada had not wanted. He had made most of his tools that way. There was a satisfaction in that which he had never quite been able to explain to anyone, though Lark had asked him to try on more than one occasion. "After midnight, then," he said. Willa did not look up from her sewing. "After midnight," she agreed. Tuck straightened up. "I can help with the bottle." "You can," said Moss. "I am strong enough." "I know you are." Tuck settled back down, satisfied, and put the chin back in both hands. Wren caught Lark's eye across the room. Lark looked away before either of them could smile. The clock in Ada's sitting room struck 11. Then the house went quiet again. The particular quiet of a home where someone has recently gone to bed, where the last light has been turned off, and the last door has been pulled gently shut. They could hear Ada moving through her bedroom for a while, the soft sound of her footsteps on the bare floorboards, the creak of the old board beside her bed that always announced when she had finally lain down. A pause, the faint sound of a page turning. She read for a little while most nights. Not long, just enough to let the day go. Then the soft click of her lamp. Then nothing, just the house breathing around them. Willa set her sewing aside and folded it once, precisely, along a line only she could see. She placed it on the shelf above her and smoothed it flat with the back of her hand. Then she stood, unhurried, and straightened her scarf. "Come then," she said. They gathered near the entrance gap. This was the part of the night that never changed, no matter what the task was, or where they were going, or how many times they had done it before. Willa stood at the front, her red scarf ends tucked in, her hands folded in front of her. The others arranged themselves behind her, Moss to her left, Wren to her right, Lark and Tuck just behind. Tuck stood very straight, the way Tuck always stood for this part. Willa took a breath. "Never let a human see you clearly," she said. Her voice was low and even, the words worn smooth with repetition, like river stones. "Never leave the building before the 3rd year. Never wake a sleeping human." Tuck mouthed the words along with her. Almost right. The pause before clearly came half a beat too early, but the shape of it was there, and Willa noticed and said nothing, because some things were better learned by doing than by correcting. Willa looked at each of them in turn. Moss, Wren, Lark, Tuck. Then she gave a single small nod. They waited. From the sitting room, through the walls and the floor, and the particular silence of the house at this hour, the clock began to strike. 1, 2, 3. Lark counted under the breath, as always. Tuck counted on fingers, which only worked up to 10, and then Tuck started again on the same fingers, which had always seemed to Lark like a perfectly reasonable solution. 10, 11, 12. The last note hung in the air for a moment, then faded into the walls. Wren went first through the gap, low and quiet, one hand on the baseboard edge. Then Lark. Then Tuck, who had to turn sideways and always did so with an expression of great dignity. Then Willa, who did not need to turn sideways and never had. Then Moss, last, pulling the gap covering back into place behind him with the careful habit of someone who had never once forgotten to do it and did not intend to start. The kitchen floor was vast and dark and smelled of the day, of the herbs Ada had been bundling that afternoon, rosemary and something sharper underneath it, thyme perhaps, and beneath that the faint mineral sharpness of ink, and beneath that the cold that came up through the old stone flags after the heating had been off for a few hours. The moonlight came through the window above the sink in a long, pale rectangle that reached almost to the table leg. Almost, but not quite. The ink bottle was just outside it, sitting in the shadow, a small dark shape against the darker shadow of the table leg. They stood for a moment at the edge of the baseboard, letting their eyes adjust. This was something Moss had taught them early. Never rush the first moment in a room. Stand still. Let the room come to you. Listen to what it is telling you before you decide anything. A room at night was not the same room it was during the day. It had different things to say, different things to show you, if you were patient enough to wait for them. The kitchen told them Ada's mug was still on the table, handle facing left, a small amount of cold tea in the bottom. Her apron was hung on the back of the door, slightly crooked, one tie longer than the other where it had been knotted in a hurry. 3 botanical sketches were spread across the far end of the worktop, held flat by a jar of dried rose hips at one corner and a smooth river stone at the other. The window above the sink was closed but not latched. It moved very slightly in some draft from somewhere, a barely perceptible shift, just enough to make the moonlight rectangle waver once every few minutes. A slow pulse, like something breathing. "The sketches are new," Lark said quietly, already looking at them from across the floor. "Later," said Wren. "I was only noting it. Note it later." Lark looked at the sketches for another moment, then back at the ink bottle. "Fine." They crossed the kitchen floor in the way they always crossed open spaces. Not in a line, not in a cluster, but spread slightly apart, each one moving at their own pace, each one aware of where the others were, without needing to look. Moss moved slowly and steadily, the way he always moved, each step placed with the quiet deliberateness of someone who had learned long ago that hurrying rarely improved anything. Wren moved efficiently, the shortest route, no deviation, her eyes moving across the floor ahead of her as she walked. Lark moved in a slight arc, passing closer to the worktop than was strictly necessary, eyes moving upward toward the botanical sketches as they passed beneath them, neck craned back. Willa walked with her hands clasped behind her back, looking at the floor, reading it the way she read everything, carefully, completely, missing nothing. The dried ink trail, the faint dusty marks near the table leg, the small dark crumb near the chair that had not been there yesterday. Tuck moved fastest of all, arriving at the table leg first, and stood looking up at the ink bottle with both hands on hips and an expression of serious professional assessment. "It is bigger than I thought," Tuck said. "Most things are," said Moss, arriving beside them. The bottle was perhaps 4 times Tuck's height, a small glass ink bottle by Ada's standards, the kind with a slightly flattened base and a short neck and a brass stopper that screwed rather than pushed. It was lying on its side with the neck pointing slightly downward, which was the only reason the ink had not all run out. The thin, dried trail on the floor was dark blue, almost black in the moonlight, and ran in a slightly curved line from where the bottle had first landed to where it had come to rest against the table leg. The glass itself was a deep cobalt blue, Ada's preference, the color she used for her finest detail work. And even lying on its side in the shadow, it caught what little light there was and held it, a small, concentrated gleam in the dark. Moss crouched beside it and put one hand flat against the glass. He was quiet for a moment, feeling the temperature of it, the slight texture of the glass under his palm. "Cold," he said. "The glass is cold. The ink will be thickened." "Is that good?" Tuck asked. "It means it will not run when we move it. So that is good." "That is good," Moss agreed. "I thought so," said Tuck. which was not entirely true, but was not entirely false either. Wren was already examining the gap between the bottle and the table leg, the slight wedge of pressure that was keeping it from rolling further. She pressed 2 fingers against the table leg and then against the bottle, measuring the resistance. "If we lift from the base end," she said, "and rotate it upright, the neck comes up last. The stopper stays down until the bottle is nearly vertical." Moss looked at where she was pointing, nodded once. Lark was still looking at the botanical sketches on the worktop above them. The moonlight caught the edge of one of them, a detailed drawing of a chamomile plant, every petal rendered in fine ink lines. The stem slightly curved, as if caught in a very gentle breeze that existed only in Ada's imagination or her memory. Lark. "Yes, sorry. Here. Base end, with Tuck." Lark came and crouched beside Tuck at the base of the bottle. The glass was smooth and cold and slightly curved under their hands. Tuck pressed both palms flat against it and looked at Lark with an expression of complete readiness. "Ready," Tuck said. "Moss," said Wren. "Neck end. Guide it as it comes up." Moss moved to the neck of the bottle and placed both hands around it, his grip careful and practiced. Thumbs on one side, fingers on the other. The leather-wrapped tool tucked safely in his belt. He had moved heavier things than this. He had moved things that had seemed impossible until they were not. And the difference between impossible and possible had always turned out to be patience and the correct angle. Willa stood slightly back, watching. This was her role in moments like this. Not to direct, not to assist, but to watch the whole of it at once. To see what the others could not see, because they were too close to their own part of it. She watched Tuck's feet, making sure they were planted. She watched the angle of Lark's wrists. She watched Moss's hands on the neck of the bottle, and the way his weight was distributed, and whether the floor beneath them was level. It was level. She had already checked. "Slowly," she said. Not a warning, just a word to set the pace, the way a conductor might raise a hand before the music begins. Lark and Tuck pushed upward from the base. The bottle shifted, a small grinding sound against the stone floor, barely anything, but in the quiet kitchen at this hour, it seemed enormous. A sound that filled the whole room and bounced off the ceiling and the cold window glass. They all froze. The house was still. Ada's bedroom was silent. The clock ticked in the sitting room, 2 rooms away, steady and indifferent. "Continue," said Willa. The bottle came up, slowly tilting, the base rising as Lark and Tuck pushed and Moss guided the neck, his hands moving with it, keeping the stopper end down, feeling the slight shift of the ink inside as the angle changed. A small liquid weight moving from one end to the other, sluggish with cold, which was exactly what they needed it to be. There was a moment, just a moment, when the bottle was at 45 degrees, and the weight of it seemed to increase suddenly, the balance point shifting, and Tuck made a small sound of effort that was not quite a word, but communicated everything a word would have. "Hold," said Moss. Calm, certain. The voice of someone who had felt this exact moment before, in other tasks, with other objects, and knew that it always passed. They held. The clock ticked. Once, twice, 3 times. Then the weight shifted back. The bottle found its new center. And with one final careful push from Lark and a steady guiding turn from Moss, it came upright. It stood on the kitchen floor, slightly away from the table leg now, perfectly vertical, the brass stopper at the top catching a point of moonlight. The dark blue ink settled at the bottom like a small, contained sea. Tuck stepped back and looked at it, with both hands still slightly raised from the effort. "There," Tuck said. "There," said Moss. He checked it twice, pressing lightly from different angles, north and south and east and west, making sure the base was sitting flat and the center of gravity was where it needed to be. The bottle did not move. He straightened up slowly, one hand on his knee as he rose, and put his tool back in the loop on his belt. They moved the bottle back against the table leg, upright this time, stable, a different relationship with the leg than before. Not wedged against it, but resting beside it, the way two things can occupy the same space without one threatening the other. "The floor," said Willa, looking at the dried ink trail. "We cannot do much about that," Lark said. "It is dried in. We can clean around it, make it look less like an accident and more like something that was always there." Lark looked at the trail. It was a thin, curved line, dark blue on dark stone, barely visible unless you were looking for it. "It is a thin line of dried ink on a kitchen floor." "Yes," said Willa, "and Ada will either notice it or she will not. But the area around it should be clean. The space around a thing matters as much as the thing itself." This was the kind of thing only Willa thought about. not just the task itself, but the appearance of the task. Not just fixing the problem, but tending to the space around the problem, so that when Ada came downstairs in the morning, the kitchen felt right, even if she could not have said exactly why, even if she never looked at the floor near the table leg at all. Wren had already found a small piece of cloth, a scrap that had fallen from Ada's apron pocket earlier in the week and been left on the floor near the door. Too small to be worth picking up, too large to disappear entirely. She brought it over, and they cleaned the stone around the ink trail carefully, working in small circles, the cloth picking up the dust and the faint, sticky residue of something sweet that had spilled and dried near the table leg at some point. Honey, perhaps, or the syrup Ada sometimes added to her evening tea when her throat was sore. Tuck cleaned the base of the table leg itself, both hands working the cloth in slow, serious circles, as if this were the most important part of the whole operation. The wood was old and slightly rough, the varnish worn away at the bottom, where feet had knocked against it over years and years of meals and mornings and ordinary days. Tuck cleaned it carefully, getting into the slight groove where the leg met the floor, working the cloth into the corner with one finger. Moss watched this without comment. The task did not require it, but he watched, the way he always watched Tuck work, with a quiet attention that was not supervision, but something closer to gratitude. When the floor was done, Lark drifted toward the worktop. "The sketches," Wren said. "Not a question, not quite a prohibition. I am not going to touch them. I only want to look." Wren looked at Moss. Moss gave a small shrug that meant, "Let them look," and also meant, "We have time," and also meant, "It will not hurt anything." A great deal of meaning for a very small movement. But Wren had been reading Moss's shrugs for long enough to understand all of it. The worktop was too high to reach from the floor, but there was a wooden chair nearby, Ada's kitchen chair, pulled slightly out from the table at the angle she always left it. The angle of someone who had stood up in a hurry and not pushed it back. Lark climbed the chair leg with the ease of long practice, hand over hand up the turned wood, feet finding the slight ridges in the lathe work, and stepped onto the seat. From there, the worktop edge was reachable. Lark pulled up onto the worktop and stood. The surface was wide and slightly cool and smelled strongly of rosemary. There were dried sprigs of it in a bundle near the back, tied with brown string, and the smell of them was clean and sharp and very present. The botanical sketches were spread in a loose fan near the front edge, held flat by the jar of rose hips and the river stone. 3 of them, all in Ada's fine ink lines. The same ink that was now standing upright in its bottle on the floor below. All on the same cream paper that had gone slightly warm in color with age. All showing different plants with the kind of careful attention that came from looking at something for a very long time before drawing it. The chamomile Lark had seen from below. Every petal accounted for, the yellow center rendered in tiny cross-hatched lines. The stem slightly curved, 2 leaves shown in detail, and a third just suggested at the edge of the page, as if Ada had run out of room, or decided the suggestion was enough. A sprig of something with small oval leaves, slightly serrated at the edges, the veins of each leaf drawn individually. Lark did not know this one, and a third, larger than the others, taking up most of the page, showing a plant with tall stems and tiny clustered flowers, each cluster made up of dozens of smaller flowers, each one rendered with extraordinary care. The stems were slightly hairy. Ada had drawn the hairs individually, each one a single fine line, slightly curved, catching an imaginary light. Lark crouched beside the large sketch and looked at it closely. The ink lines were very fine here, finer than in the other 2 drawings, as if Ada had used a different pen, or simply pressed more lightly, more carefully. The flowers at the top of the stems were fully open. The ones lower down were still closed, tight little buds. And in the middle, between the open and the closed, there were flowers at every stage of opening, some just beginning to separate, some halfway, some almost there. As if Ada had drawn the whole life of the plant in a single image. "Willa," Lark called down quietly, "what is this one? The tall one, with the small flowers in clusters." A pause from below. Willa straightened up. "Describe the leaves." "Long, narrow. The stem is slightly hairy. She has drawn the hairs individually, each one." "Meadowsweet," said Willa. "What is it for?" "Sleep," said Willa, "among other things. It has a sweet smell, like almonds and honey together, but lighter than either. It grows near water usually, along river banks, the edges of meadows where the ground stays damp." Lark looked at the drawing for a moment longer. "She has drawn it at different stages. Some flowers open, some closed, some in between." She would have sat with it for a long time, said Willa. You cannot draw something like that from memory. You have to watch it. Do you think she grew it herself, or found it somewhere? I could not say. Perhaps both. Perhaps she found it first, and then grew it so she could keep watching it. Lark considered this. The idea of watching something so carefully that you needed to keep it close, to have it where you could return to it. She takes care of things, Lark said. She does, said Willa. The plants in the shop, the drawings, the chamomile every night. Lark paused. She takes care of everything around her. Does she take care of herself, do you think? A longer pause from below. I think, said Willa carefully, that people who are very good at taking care of things sometimes find that the hardest thing to remember. Lark looked at the meadowsweet drawing for another moment, at the flowers in all their stages, open and closed, and somewhere between. That is not a sad thing, is it? Lark said. It is just a thing that is true. Yes, said Willa. That is exactly what it is. Lark stood up slowly and looked around the worktop. The rosemary bundle, the river stone, the jar of rose hips, each one a small dark red, slightly wrinkled, the color of something that had been warm once and remembered it. The 3 sketches spread in their loose fan. She is good at this, Lark said. Not to anyone in particular, just to the room. She is, said Wren from the floor below, quietly, as if she had not meant to say it aloud. Lark climbed back down from the worktop, down to the chair seat, then down the chair leg, hand over hand, feet finding the ridges, and they gathered near the center of the kitchen floor. The ink bottle stood upright against the table leg. The floor around it was clean. The sketches were undisturbed. Ada's mug was still on the table, handle facing left. Cold tea in the bottom. Everything was as it should be. Everything was slightly better than it had been. Moss looked around the kitchen once. The slow, complete look he always gave a room when the work was done. The look that was not checking so much as acknowledging. The room, the work, the fact of it. Then he turned toward the baseboard. Right, he said. They crossed back the way they had come. Lark paused once, halfway across the floor, and looked back at the ink bottle standing upright in the shadow of the table leg. The brass stopper catching its small point of moonlight. She will not know, Lark said. Not sadly, just noting it, the way Moss noted most things. No, said Wren. Does that matter to you? Wren thought about this for a moment. a real moment, not a polite one. Her eyes moved to the bottle, then to the clean floor around it, then to the worktop where the sketches lay. "No," she said, "it does not." Lark looked at her. "Why not?" Wren was quiet for a moment. "Because the bottle is upright," she said finally. "That is the thing that needed to happen. Whether she knows how it happened does not change that it happened." Lark thought about this. "Moss," Lark said, "does it matter to you that she does not know?" Moss had already turned back toward the baseboard. He paused without turning around. "No," he said. Then, after a moment, "The work is the thing, not the knowing about the work." He started walking again. Lark looked at the bottle one more time, then followed, back through the gap, Moss last, pulling the covering back into place with the same careful habit, the same quiet click of it settling into position. The familiar smell of the home, chamomile and old wood, and the faint sweetness of the candle that had burned down another 1/4 inch while they were gone. The wax pooling slightly on one side where the flame had leaned in a draught. The low ceiling, the shelves, the acorn cap bowls, the cork stopper, the small curl of wood shaving still on the floor beside Moss's stool that he would sweep away in the morning. Willa went to the shelf and took down the chamomile teacup. It was not a teacup in the way Ada would have understood the word. It was a thimble, a small brass thimble that had fallen from Ada's sewing box 3 months ago and rolled under the dresser and been forgotten entirely, the way small things are forgotten when there is too much else to think about. Willa had found it on one of the early nights, lying on its side in the dust, and had brought it home and cleaned it with a scrap of soft cloth until the brass shone, and set it on the highest shelf where it caught the candlelight and held it warmly. Each night before they went out, Willa collected the last small amount of chamomile tea from whatever Ada had left unfinished. A drop from the bottom of a mug, a small pool from a spilled cup. Once an almost full amount from a cup Ada had made and then forgotten entirely, distracted by something in one of her sketchbooks, the tea going cold and untouched on the kitchen table. Willa warmed it on the candle flame in a tiny copper dish, a button back that had lost its button, found in the same week as the thimble, as if the house had been offering things, and poured it into the thimble and set it in the center of the floor. Tonight there was a good amount. Ada had made chamomile before bed and drunk most of it, but not all, and the last inch in the bottom of the mug had been enough to fill the thimble almost to the rim. Willa had warmed it carefully, watching the surface of it for the first small movement that meant it was ready, and poured it slowly. And now it sat in the center of the floor, with a thin curl of steam rising from it into the candle-lit air. She set it down and stepped back. They settled around it. This, too, was a ritual, though an unspoken one. Each of them finding their particular spot, their particular way of sitting, the arrangement that had established itself over time without anyone deciding it. Moss, on his low stool, pulled close, his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely folded. Willa beside him, her legs folded, her red scarf ends spread across her lap, her sewing retrieved from the shelf and set beside her, though she did not pick it up. Wren, with her back against the wall, knees up, arms resting across them, her head tipped back slightly against the wood. Lark, cross-legged, leaning slightly forward, elbows on knees, looking at the thimble with the same focused attention Lark gave to everything worth looking at. Tuck pressed close to Wren's side, one small hand resting on Wren's knee without either of them remarking on it, as if it had always been there and always would be. For a while, nobody said anything. This was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of people who had been together long enough that silence was simply another way of being together. Not the absence of something, but the presence of something else, something that did not need words. The clock ticked in the sitting room. 2 rooms away, through the walls and the floor, steady and slow, marking time that the Tidwells were not particularly interested in marking. Tuck looked at the thimble. The steam was thinning now as it cooled, the curl of it becoming more delicate, more intermittent. "Can I?" Tuck said. "In a moment," said Willa. "Let it cool a little more." Tuck looked at it for another moment. The brass of the thimble had gone from bright to warm in the candlelight, a deep amber gold. "It smells like the shop," Tuck said. "It comes from the shop," said Willa. "Ada makes it from her own chamomile. The dried flowers she keeps in the 3rd drawer from the left on the bottom row." Tuck considered this. The idea of the tea having a specific origin, a specific drawer, a specific place in Ada's careful ordering of things. "Does she know it is the best thing?" Tuck said. "Does she know how good it is?" "I think she does," said Willa. "I think that is why she makes it every night, even when she is tired, even when it would be easier not to." Tuck thought about this with great seriousness, the way Tuck thought about most things, completely, without reservation, giving it the full weight of attention it deserved. Then nodded, slowly, as if something had been confirmed that had been suspected for some time. Moss reached out and touched the side of the thimble with one finger, testing the warmth of it the way he tested everything. Not with urgency, but with patience, waiting for the thing to tell him what it needed to tell him. "Ready," he said. Tuck leaned forward and cupped both hands around the thimble, not lifting it, just holding it, feeling the warmth come through the brass into the palms, into the fingers, spreading up through the wrists. Eyes closed for a moment. The smell of chamomile rising up, warm and slightly sweet and very particular. The smell of something that had been grown carefully and dried carefully and kept carefully and made into something good. Then Tuck sat back, satisfied, and Wren reached over without opening her eyes and tucked a small piece of folded cloth around Tuck's shoulders. Tuck pulled it closer without comment. Lark was looking at the ceiling. "Meadowsweet," Lark said quietly, to no one in particular, or to all of them equally, which was sometimes the same thing. Said Moss. "For sleep. She draws things that help people sleep, and then she makes chamomile tea before bed." A pause. "She takes care of people, even when she is tired, even when there is no one there to notice." Nobody answered this. It did not need an answer. It sat in the warm air of the small room and was true, and that was enough. And the candle flame leaned very slightly in some imperceptible movement of air, and then straightened again. Willa picked up her sewing from beside her and held it in her lap without beginning. The green cloth, the nearly invisible stitches along the hem. She ran her thumb along the edge of it, feeling the work she had already done, the evenness of it. She noticed the chamomile drawing, Willa said. Not a question. "She drew it," said Lark. "She must have noticed it a great deal to draw it like that." "Every petal," said Willa. "Every petal," Lark agreed. Moss was quiet for a moment. The candle flame leaned again and straightened. "She pays attention," he said, "to the things she cares about." "Yes," said Willa. "That is a good way to be," said Moss. The room was quiet again. The clock ticked. Tuck had stopped looking at the thimble and was now looking at the candle flame, watching it with the same complete attention. The way the flame moved and recovered, moved and recovered. A constant small negotiation with the air around it. "Moss," Tuck said. The cork stopper, the one on the shelf. What are you going to do with it?" Moss looked at the cork stopper on the shelf. He had been looking at it in the way he looked at things he was thinking about for several weeks now. "I am not certain yet," he said. "But you have an idea." "I have the beginning of an idea." Tuck looked at the cork stopper, then at Moss. "Will you tell me when you know?" "I will show you," said Moss, "when I know." Tuck seemed to find this entirely satisfactory and went back to watching the candle flame. Wren's eyes were closed. Her breathing had slowed. Her shoulders dropped slightly from where they usually sat. The particular loosening that happened when the night's work was done and there was nothing left to assess or organize or protect against. Just the room, just the warmth, just the familiar smell of chamomile and old wood, and the candle burning down. Moss's hands were still on his knees. Willa's fingers had stopped moving, the thread loose in her lap, the green cloth folded over her hands like something she was keeping warm. Tuck had leaned sideways, very gradually, the way Tuck always leaned at this hour. A slow, inevitable drift, like something finding its natural resting place, until a small head rested against Wren's arm. Wren did not open her eyes. She simply shifted slightly to make the angle more comfortable, and her arm came down a little so that Tuck's head was properly supported. And that was all. Lark looked at each of them in turn. Moss with his still hands, Willa with her loose thread, Wren with her closed eyes and her arm adjusted without waking. Tuck, already most of the way to sleep, the small chest rising and falling slowly, the folded cloth pulled up close. Then Lark lay back on the floor, hands folded on the chest, and looked up at the low ceiling of the only home any of them had ever known. The wood above was dark and close and familiar, marked in places by the small accumulated evidence of years. A faint groove where something had been moved repeatedly. A darker patch near the corner where the candle smoke had drifted over a long time. A tiny knot in the wood that Tuck had once decided looked like a sleeping face, and that Lark had never been able to unsee since. The candle burned lower. The thimble cooled slowly. The steam gone now. The chamomile inside it, still and dark and faintly fragrant. The clock in the sitting room ticked through the walls, steady, unhurried, indifferent to the hour, marking time the way the river marked the valley, not because it chose to, but because that was simply what it did. Outside, somewhere in Fernhollow, something settled in the dark. A branch releasing the last of its tension from the day. A shutter finding its resting place against a wall. The old village breathing in its sleep, the way it had breathed for longer than anyone could remember, the way it would go on breathing long after this particular midnight had become morning. Ada slept in her room 2 doors away. Her sketches lay on the worktop in the dark kitchen. The meadow sweet with its careful, hairy stems. The chamomile with every petal. The plant with the small oval leaves that Lark had not been able to name and would ask Willa about tomorrow at dusk through the gap in the baseboard. The ink bottle stood upright against the table leg. The brass stopper caught nothing now. The moonlight had moved on. The long, pale rectangle shifted with the turning of the night, and the kitchen was darker than it had been, and quieter, and the bottle stood in that darkness exactly as it should, exactly as it had not been standing before they came out. And the floor around it was clean, and the space around the thing was tended, and that was enough. That was exactly enough. Lark's eyes closed. The candle flame leaned once more, very slowly, and did not quite straighten this time. And the light in the small room behind the baseboard grew softer and more amber, and then softer still. Moss did not move. Willa did not move. The clock ticked. The chamomile sat cool in its thimble, and in the warm house above the herbalist shop, in the village of Fernhollow, the Tidwells slept.